Agatha Christie, The Face of Helen. Mr. Satterthwaite was at the opera and sat alone in his big box on the first tier outside the door was a printed card bearing his name. An appreciator and a connoisseur of all the arts, Mr. Satterthwaite was especially fond of good music, and was a regular subscriber to Covent Garden every year, reserving a box for Tuesdays and Fridays throughout the season. But it was not often that he sat in it alone. He was a gregarious little gentleman, and he liked filling his box with the elite of the great world to which he belonged, and also with the aristocracy of the artistic world in which he was equally at home. He was alone tonight because a countess had disappointed him. The countess, besides being a beautiful and celebrated woman, was also a good mother. Her children had been attacked by that common and distressing disease, the mumps, and the countess remained at home in tearful confabulation with exquisitely starched nurses. Her husband, who had supplied her with the aforementioned children and a title, but who was otherwise a complete nonentity, had seized at the chance to escape. Nothing bored him more than music. So Mr. Satterthwaite sat alone. Cavalier Rusticate and Pagliacci were being given that night, and since the first had never appealed to him, he arrived just after the curtain went down on Santuzza's death agony, in time to glance round the house with practised eyes before everyone streamed out, bent on paying visits or fighting for coffee or lemonade. Mr. Satterthwaite adjusted his opera glasses, looked round the house, marked down his prey, and sallied forth with a well-mapped-out plan of campaign ahead of him. A plan, however, which he did not put into execution, for just outside his box he cannoned into a tall, dark man, and recognized him with a pleasurable thrill of excitement. "Mr. Quinn!" cried Mr. Satterthwaite. He seized his friend warmly by the hand, clutching him as though he feared any minute to see him vanish into thin air. "You must share my box," said Mr. Satterthwaite determinedly. "You are not with a party?" "No, I am sitting by myself in the stalls," responded Mr. Quinn with a smile. "Then that is settled," said Mr. Satterthwaite with a sigh of relief. His manner was almost comic, had there been anyone to observe it. "You are very kind," said Mr. Quinn. "Not at all. It is a pleasure. I didn't know you were fond of music. There are reasons why I am attracted to Pagliacci." "Ah, of course," said Mr. Satterthwaite, nodding sapiently, though, if put to it, he would have found it hard to explain just why he had used that expression. "Of course, you would be." They went back to the box at the first summons of the bell, and leaning over the front of it, they watched the people returning to the stalls. "That's a beautiful head," observed Mr. Satterthwaite suddenly. He indicated with his glasses a spot immediately beneath them in the stall's circle. A girl sat there whose face they could not see, only the pure gold of her hair that fitted with the closeness of a cap till it merged into the white neck. "A Greek head," said Mr. Satterthwaite reverently. "Pure Greek." He sighed happily. "It's a remarkable thing when you come to think of it, how very few people have hair that fits them. It's more noticeable now that everyone is shingled." "You are so observant," said Mr. Quinn. "I see things," admitted Mr. Satterthwaite. "I do see things. For instance, I picked out that head at once. We must have a look at her face sooner or later, but it won't match, I'm sure. That would be a chance in 1,000. Almost as the words left his lips, the lights flickered and went down. The sharp rap of the conductor's baton was heard, and the opera began. A new tenor, said to be a second Caruso, was singing that night. He had been referred to by the newspapers as a Jugoslav, a Czech, an Albanian, a Magyar, and a Bulgarian, with a beautiful impartiality. He had given an extraordinary concert at the Albert Hall, a programme of the folk songs of his native hills, with a specially tuned orchestra. They were in strange half-tones, and the would-be musical had pronounced them too marvellous. Real musicians had reserved judgment, realizing that the ear had to be specially trained and attuned before any criticism was possible. It was quite a relief to some people to find this evening that Joachim could sing in ordinary Italian with all the traditional sobs and quivers. The curtain went down on the first act, and applause burst out vociferously. Mr. Satterthwaite turned to Mr. Quinn. He realized that the latter was waiting for him to pronounce judgment, and plumed himself a little. After all, he knew. As a critic he was well-nigh infallible. Very slowly he nodded his head. "It is the real thing," he said. "You think so?" As fine a voice as Caruso's. "People will not recognize that it is so at first, for his technique is not yet perfect. There are ragged edges, a lack of certainty in the attack. But the voice is there. Magnificent." "I went to his concert at the Albert Hall," said Mr. Quinn. "Did you? I could not go." "He made a wonderful hit with a shepherd's song." "I read about it," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "The refrain ends each time with a high note, a kind of cry, a note midway between A and B flat. Very curious." Yoshbim had taken 3 calls, bowing and smiling. The lights went up and the people began to file out. Mr. Satterthwaite leant over to watch the girl with the golden head. She rose, adjusted her scarf and turned. Mr. Satterthwaite caught his breath. There were, he knew, such faces in the world, faces that made history. The girl moved to the gangway, her companion, a young man, beside her, and Mr. Satterthwaite noticed how every man in the vicinity looked, and continued to look covertly. "Beauty," said Mr. Satterthwaite to himself. "There is such a thing. Not charm, nor attraction, nor magnetism, nor any of the things we talk about so glibly, just sheer beauty. The shape of a face, the line of an eyebrow, the curve of a jaw." He quoted softly under his breath, "The face that launched 1,000 ships." And for the first time he realized the meaning of those words. He glanced across at Mr. Quinn, who was watching him in what seemed such perfect comprehension that Mr. Satterthwaite felt there was no need for words. "I've always wondered," he said simply, "what such women were really like." "You mean the Helens, the Cleopatras, the Mary Stuarts?" Mr. Quinn nodded thoughtfully. "If we go out," he suggested, "we may see." They went out together, and their quest was successful. The pair they were in search of were seated on a lounge halfway up the staircase. For the first time, Mr. Satterthwaite noted the girl's companion, a dark young man, not handsome, but with a suggestion of restless fire about him. A face full of strange angles, jutting cheekbones, a forceful, slightly crooked jaw, deep-set eyes that were curiously light under the dark, overhanging brows. "An interesting face," said Mr. Satterthwaite to himself. "A real face. It means something." The young man was leaning forward, talking earnestly. The girl was listening. Neither of them belonged to Mr. Satterthwaite's world. He took them to be of the arty class. The girl wore a rather shapeless garment of cheap green silk. Her shoes were of soiled white satin. The young man wore his evening clothes with an air of being uncomfortable in them. The 2 men passed and repassed several times. The 4th time they did so, the couple had been joined by a 3rd, a fair young man with a suggestion of the clerk about him. With his coming, a certain tension had set in. The newcomer was fidgeting with his tie and seemed ill at ease. The girl's beautiful face was turned gravely up towards him, and her companion was scowling furiously. "The usual story," said Mr. Quinn very softly as they passed. "Yes," said Mr. Satterthwaite with a sigh. "It's inevitable, I suppose. The snarling of 2 dogs over a bone. It always has been. It always will be. And yet one could wish for something different. Beauty." He stopped. Beauty to Mr. Satterthwaite meant something very wonderful. He found it difficult to speak of it. He looked at Mr. Quinn, who nodded his head gravely in understanding. They went back to their seats for the 2nd act. At the close of the performance, Mr. Satterthwaite turned eagerly to his friend. "It is a wet night. My car is here. You must allow me to drive you, somewhere." The last word was Mr. Satterthwaite's delicacy coming into play. To drive you home would, he felt, have savoured of curiosity. Mr. Quinn had always been singularly reticent. It was extraordinary how little Merton Satterthwaite knew about him. "But perhaps," continued the little man, "you have your own car waiting?" "No," said Mr. Quinn. "I have no car waiting." "Then—" But Mr. Quinn shook his head. "You are most kind," he said, "but I prefer to go my own way. Besides," he said with a rather curious smile, "if anything should—" happen. It will be for you to act. Good night, and thank you. Once again we have seen drama together." He had gone so quickly that Mr. Satterthwaite had no time to protest, but he was left with a faint uneasiness stirring in his mind. To what drama did Mr. Quinn refer? Pagliacci or another? Masters, Mr. Satterthwaite's chauffeur, was in the habit of waiting in a side street. His master disliked the long delay while the cars drew up in turn before the opera house. Now, as on previous occasions, he walked rapidly round the corner and along the street towards where he knew he should find Masters awaiting him. Just in front of him were a girl and a man, and even as he recognized them, another man joined them. It all broke out in a minute. A man's voice, angrily uplifted, another man's voice in injured protest, and then the scuffle. Blows, angry breathing, more blows, the form of a policeman appearing majestically from nowhere, and in another minute Mr. Satterthwaite was beside the girl, where she shrank back against the wall. "Allow me," he said. "You must not stay here." He took her by the arm and marshalled her swiftly down the street. Once she looked back. "Oughtn't I—" she began uncertainly. Mr. Satterthwaite shook his head. "It would be very unpleasant for you to be mixed up in it. You would probably be asked to go along to the police station with them. I am sure neither of your friends would wish that." He stopped. "This is my car. If you will allow me to do so, I shall have much pleasure in driving you home." The girl looked at him searchingly. The staid respectability of Mr. Satterthwaite impressed her favourably. She bent her head. "Thank you," she said, and got into the car, the door of which Masters was holding open. In reply to a question from Mr. Satterthwaite, she gave an address in Chelsea, and he got in beside her. The girl was upset and not in the mood for talking, and Mr. Satterthwaite was COQ tactful to intrude upon her thoughts. Presently, however, she turned to him and spoke of her own accord. "I wish," she said pettishly, "people wouldn't be so silly." "It is a nuisance," agreed Mr. Satterthwaite. His matter-of-fact manner put her at her ease, and she went on as though feeling the need of confiding in someone. "It wasn't as though— well, it was like this Mr. Eastney and I have been friends for a long time, ever since I came to London. He's taken no end of trouble about my voice, and got me some very good introductions, and he's been more kind to me than I can say. He's absolutely music mad. It was very good of him to take me tonight. I'm sure he can't really afford it. And then Mr. Burns came up and spoke to us, quite nicely, I'm sure, and Phil, Mr. Eastney, got sulky about it. I don't know why he should. It's a free country, I'm sure. And Mr. Burns is always pleasant and good-tempered. Then just as we were walking to the tube, he came up and joined us, and he hadn't so much as said 2 words before Philip flew out at him like a madman. And, oh, I don't like it." "Don't you?" asked Mr. Satterthwaite very softly. She blushed, but very little. There was none of the conscious siren about her. A certain measure of pleasurable excitement in being fought for there must be. That was only nature. But Mr. Satterthwaite decided that a worried perplexity lay uppermost, and he had the clue to it in another moment when she observed inconsequently, "I do hope he hasn't hurt him." Now which is him? Thought Mr. Satterthwaite, smiling to himself in the darkness. He backed his own judgment and said, "You hope Mr. Eastney hasn't hurt Mr. Burns?" She nodded. "Yes, that's what I said. It seems so dreadful. I wish I knew." The car was drawing up. "Are you on the telephone?" he asked. "Yes." "If you like, I will find out exactly what has happened, and then telephone to you." The girl's face brightened. "Oh, that would be very kind of you. Are you sure it's not too much bother?" "Not in the least." She thanked him again and gave him her telephone number, adding with a touch of shyness, "My name is Gillian West." As he was driven through the night, bound on his errand, a curious smile came to Mr. Satterthwaite's lips. He thought, "So that is all it is. The shape of a face, the curve of a jaw." But he fulfilled his promise. So, The following Sunday afternoon, Mr. Satterthwaite went to Kew Gardens to admire the rhododendrons. Very long ago, incredibly long ago it seemed to Mr. Satterthwaite, he had driven down to Kew Gardens with a certain young lady to see the bluebells. Mr. Satterthwaite had arranged very carefully beforehand in his own mind exactly what he was going to say, and the precise words he would use in asking the young lady for her hand in marriage. He was just conning them over in his mind, and responding to her raptures about the bluebells a little absent-mindedly, when the shock came. The young lady stopped exclaiming at the bluebells and suddenly confided in Mr. Satterthwaite, as a true friend, her love for another. Mr. Satterthwaite put away the little set speech he had prepared and hastily rummaged for sympathy and friendship in the bottom drawer of his mind. Such was Mr. Satterthwaite's romance, a rather tepid early Victorian one, but it had left him with a romantic attachment to Kew Gardens, and he would often go there to see the bluebells, or, if he had been abroad later than usual, the rhododendrons, and would sigh to himself and feel rather sentimental, and really enjoy himself very much indeed in an old-fashioned romantic way. This particular afternoon he was strolling back past the tea-houses when he recognized a couple sitting at one of the small tables on the grass. They were Gillian West and the fair young man, and at that same moment they recognized him. He saw the girl flush and speak eagerly to her companion. In another minute he was shaking hands with them both in his correct, rather prim fashion, and had accepted the shy invitation proffered him to have tea with them. "I can't tell you, sir," said Mr. Burns, "how grateful I am to you for looking after Gillian the other night. She told me all about it." "Yes, indeed," said the girl. "It was ever so kind of you." Mr. Satterthwaite felt pleased and interested in the pair. Their naivete and sincerity touched him. Also, it was to him a peep into a world with which he was not well acquainted. These people were of a class unknown to him. In his little dried-up way, Mr. Satterthwaite could be very sympathetic. Very soon he was hearing all about his new friends. He noted that Mr. Burns had become Charlie, and he was not unprepared for the statement that the two were engaged. "As a matter of fact," said Mr. Burns with refreshing candour, "it just happened this afternoon, didn't it, Gil?" Burns was a clerk in a shipping firm. He was making a fair salary, had a little money of his own, and the two proposed to be married quite soon. Mr. Satterthwaite listened and nodded and congratulated. An ordinary young man, he thought to himself, a very ordinary young man. Nice, straightforward young chap, plenty to say for himself, good opinion of himself without being conceited, nice-looking without being unduly handsome, nothing remarkable about him and will never set the Thames on fire, and the girl loves him. Aloud he said, "And Mr. Eastney—" He purposely broke off, but he had said enough to produce an effect for which he was not unprepared. Charlie Burns's face darkened, and Gillian looked troubled. More than troubled, he thought. She looked afraid. "I don't like it," she said in a low voice. Her words were addressed to Mr. Satterthwaite, as though she knew by instinct that he would understand a feeling incomprehensible to her lover. "You see, he's done a lot for me. He's encouraged me to take up singing and helped me with it. But I've known all the time that my voice wasn't really good, not first class. Of course, I've had engagements." She stopped. "You've had a bit of trouble too," said Burns. "A girl wants someone to look after her. Gillian's had a lot of unpleasantness, Mr. Satterthwaite. Altogether she's had a lot of unpleasantness. She's a good looker, as you can see, and, well, that often leads to trouble for a girl." Between them, Mr. Satterthwaite became enlightened as to various happenings which were vaguely classed by Burns under the heading of unpleasantness. A young man who had shot himself, the extraordinary conduct of a bank manager who was a married man, a violent stranger who must have been balmy, the wild behaviour of an elderly artist, a trail of violence and tragedy that Gillian West had left in her wake, recited in the commonplace tones of Charles Burns. "And it's my opinion," he ended, "that this fellow Eastney is a bit cracked. Gillian would have had trouble with him if I hadn't turned up to look after her." His laugh sounded a little fatuous to Mr. Satterthwaite, and no responsive smile came to the girl's face. She was looking earnestly at Mr. Satterthwaite. "Phil's all right," she said slowly. "He cares for me, I know, and I care for him like a friend, but not anything more. I don't know how he'll take the news about Charlie, I'm sure. I'm so afraid he'll be—" She stopped, inarticulate in face of the dangers she vaguely sensed. "If I can help you in any way," said Mr. Satterthwaite warmly, "pray command me." He fancied Charlie Burns looked vaguely resentful, but Gillian said at once, "Thank you." Mr. Satterthwaite left his new friends after having promised to take tea with Gillian on the following Thursday. When Thursday came, Mr. Satterthwaite felt a little thrill of pleasurable anticipation. He thought, "I'm an old man, but not too old to be thrilled by a face. Then he shook his head with a sense of foreboding. Gillian was alone. Charlie Burns was to come in later. She looked much happier, Mr. Satterthwaite thought, as though a load had been lifted from her mind. Indeed, she frankly admitted as much. "I dreaded telling Phil about Charles. It was silly of me. I ought to have known Phil better. He was upset, of course, but no one could have been sweeter. Really sweet he was. Look what he sent me this morning. A wedding present. Isn't it magnificent?" It was indeed rather magnificent for a young man in Philip Eastney's circumstances. A 4-valve wireless set, of the latest type. "We both love music so much, you see," he explained the girl. "Phil said that when I was listening to a concert on this, I should always think of him a little. And I'm sure I shall, because we have been such friends." "You must be proud of your friend," said Mr. Satterthwaite gently. "He seems to have taken the blow like a true sportsman." Gillian nodded. He saw the quick tears come into her eyes. "He asked me to do one thing for him. Tonight is the anniversary of the day we first met. He asked me if I would stay at home quietly this evening and listen to the wireless program, not to go out with Charlie anywhere. I said of course I would, and that I was very touched, and that I would think of him with a lot of gratitude and affection." Mr. Satterthwaite nodded, but he was puzzled. He was seldom at fault in his delineation of character, and he would have judged Philip Eastney quite incapable of such a sentimental request. The young man must be of a more banal order than he supposed. Gillian evidently thought the idea quite in keeping with her rejected lover's character. Mr. Satterthwaite was a little, just a little, disappointed. He was sentimental himself, and knew it, but he expected better things of the rest of the world. Besides, sentiment belonged to his age. It had no part to play in the modern world. He asked Gillian to sing, and she complied. He told her voice was charming, but he knew quite well in his own mind that it was distinctly second class. Any success that could have come to her in the profession she had adopted would have been won by her face, not her voice. He was not particularly anxious to see young Burns again, so presently he rose to go. It was at that moment that his attention was attracted by an ornament on the mantelpiece, which stood out among the other rather gimcrack objects like a jewel on a dust heap. It was a curving beaker of thin green glass, long-stemmed and graceful, and poised on the edge of it was what looked like a gigantic soap bubble, a ball of iridescent glass. Gillian noticed his absorption. "That's an extra wedding present from Phil. It's rather pretty, I think. He works in a sort of glass factory." "It is a beautiful thing," said Mr. Satterthwaite reverently. "The glass blowers of Murano might have been proud of that." He went away with his interest in Philip Eastney strangely stimulated, an extraordinarily interesting young man, and yet the girl with the wonderful face preferred Charlie Burns. What a strange and inscrutable universe. It had just occurred to Mr. Satterthwaite that, owing to the remarkable beauty of Gillian West, his evening with Mr. Quinn had somehow missed fire. As a rule, every meeting with that mysterious individual had resulted in some strange and unforeseen happening. It was with the hope of perhaps running against the man of mystery that Mr. Satterthwaite bent his steps towards the Arlecchino restaurant, where once, in the days gone by, he had met Mr. Quinn, and which Mr. Quinn had said he often frequented. Mr. Satterthwaite went from room to room at the Arlecchino, looking hopefully about him, but there was no sign of Mr. Quinn's dark, smiling face. There was, however, somebody else. Sitting at a small table alone was Philip Eastney. The place was crowded, and Mr. Satterthwaite took his seat opposite the young man. He felt a sudden strange sense of exultation, as though he were caught up and made part of a shimmering pattern of events. He was in this thing, whatever it was. He knew now what Mr. Quin had meant that evening at the opera. There was a drama going on, and in it was a part, an important part, for Mr. Satterthwaite. He must not fail to take his cue and speak his lines. He sat down opposite Philip Eastney with the sense of accomplishing the inevitable. It was easy enough to get into conversation. Eastney seemed anxious to talk. Mr. Satterthwaite was, as always, an encouraging and sympathetic listener. They talked of the war, of explosives, of poison gases. Eastney had a lot to say about these last, for during the greater part of the war he had been engaged in their jay manufacture. Mr. Satterthwaite found him really interesting. There was one gas, Eastney said, that had never been tried. The armistice had come too soon. Great things had been hoped for it. One whiff of it was deadly. He warmed to animation as he spoke. Having broken the ice, Mr. Satterthwaite gently turned the conversation to music. Eastney's thin face lit up. He spoke with the passion and abandon of the real music lover. They discussed Yoshbim, and the young man was enthusiastic. Both he and Mr. Satterthwaite agreed that nothing on earth could surpass a really fine tenor voice. Eastney, as a boy, had heard Caruso, and he had never forgotten it. "Do you know that he could sing to a wine glass and shatter it?" he demanded. "I always thought that was a fable," said Mr. Satterthwaite, smiling. "No, it's gospel truth, I believe. The thing's quite possible. It's a question of resonance." He went off into technical details. His face was flushed, and his eyes shone. The subject seemed to fascinate him, and Mr. Satterthwaite noted that he seemed to have a thorough grasp of what he was talking about. The elder man realized that he was talking to an exceptional brain, a brain that might almost be described as that of a genius. Brilliant, erratic, undecided as yet as to the true channel to give it outlet, but undoubtedly genius. And he thought of Charlie Burns and wondered at Gillian West. It was with quite a start that he realized how late it was getting, and he called for his bill. Eastney looked slightly apologetic. "I'm ashamed of myself, running on so," he said, "but it was a lucky chance sent you along here tonight. I needed someone to talk to this evening." He ended his speech with a curious little laugh. His eyes were still blazing with some subdued excitement. Yet there was something tragic about him. "It has been quite a pleasure," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "Our conversation has been most interesting and instructive to me." He then made his funny, courteous little bow and passed out of the restaurant. The night was a warm one, and as he walked slowly down the street, a very odd fancy came to him. He had the feeling that he was not alone, that someone was walking by his side. In vain he told himself that the idea was a delusion. It persisted. Someone was walking beside him down that dark, quiet street, someone whom he could not see. He wondered what it was that brought the figure of Mr. Quin so clearly before his mind. He felt exactly as though Mr. Quin were there, walking beside him, and yet he had only to use his eyes to assure himself that it was not so, that he was alone. But the thought of Mr. Quin persisted, and with it came something else, a need, an urgency of some kind, an oppressive foreboding of calamity. There was something he must do, and do quickly. There was something very wrong, and it lay in his hands to put it right. So strong was the feeling that Mr. Satterthwaite forebore to fight against it. Instead, he shut his eyes and tried to bring that mental image of Mr. Quin nearer. If he could only have asked Mr. Quin. But even as the thought flashed through his mind, he knew it was wrong. It was never any use asking Mr. Quin anything. "The threads are all in your hands." That was the kind of thing Mr. Quin would say. The threads? Threads of what? He analyzed his own feeling and impressions carefully. That presentiment of danger now. Whom did it threaten? At once a picture rose up before his eyes, the picture of Gillian West sitting alone listening to the wireless. Mr. Satterthwaite flung a penny to a passing newspaper boy and snatched at a paper. He turned at once to the London radio programme. Yoshbim was broadcasting tonight, he noted with interest. He was singing Salve Dimora from Faust, and afterwards a selection of his folk songs, the shepherd's song, the fish, the little deer, etc. Mr. Satterthwaite crumpled the paper together. The knowledge of what Gillian was listening to seemed to make the picture of her clearer. Sitting there alone. An odd request, that of Philip Eastney's. Not like the man, not like him at all. There was no sentimentality in Eastney. He was a man of violent feeling. A dangerous man, perhaps. Again his thought brought up with a jerk. A dangerous man, that meant something. The threads are all in your hands. That meeting with Philip Eastney tonight, rather odd. A lucky chance, Eastney had said. Was it chance? Or was it part of that interwoven design of which Mr. Satterthwaite had once or twice been conscious this evening? He cast his mind back. There must be something in Eastney's conversation, some clue there. There must, or else why this strange feeling of urgency? What had he talked about? Singing, war work, Caruso. Caruso, Mr. Satterthwaite's thoughts went off at a tangent. Yoshbim's voice was very nearly equal to that of Caruso. Gillian would be sitting listening to it now as it rang out, true and powerful, echoing round the room, setting glasses ringing. He caught his breath. Glasses ringing. Caruso, singing to a wine-glass, and the wine-glass breaking. Yoshbim singing in the London studio, and in a room over a mile away the crash and tinkle of glass. Not a wine-glass, a thin green glass beaker. A crystal soap bubble falling, a soap bubble that perhaps was not empty. It was at that moment that Mr. Satterthwaite, as judged by passers-by, suddenly went mad. He tore open the newspaper once more, took a brief glance at the wireless announcements, and then began to run for his life down the quiet street. At the end of it, he found a crawling taxi, and jumping into it, he yelled an address to the driver and the information that it was life or death to get there quickly. The driver, judging him, mentally afflicted but rich, did his utmost. Mr. Satterthwaite lay back, his head a jumble of fragmentary thoughts, forgotten bits of science learned at school, phrases used by Eastney that night. Resonance, natural periods. If the period of the force coincides with the natural period, there was something about a suspension bridge, soldiers marching over it and the swing of their stride being the same as the period of the bridge. Eastney had studied the subject. Eastney knew, and Eastney was a genius. At 10:45, Yoshbim was to broadcast. It was that now. Yes, but the Faust had to come first. It was the shepherd's song, with the great shout after the refrain that would do what? His mind went whirling round again. Tones, overtones, half-tones. He didn't know much about these things, but Eastney knew. Pray heaven he would be in time. The taxi stopped. Mr. Satterthwaite flung himself out and raced up the stone stairs to a second floor like a young athlete. The door of the flat was ajar. He pushed it open, and the great tenor voice welcomed him. The words of the shepherd's song were familiar to him in a less unconventional setting. Shepherd, see thy horse's flowing mane. He was in time then. He burst open the sitting-room door. Gillian was sitting there in a tall chair by the fireplace. Byra Misha's daughter is to wed today. To the wedding I must haste away. She must have thought him mad. He clutched at her, crying out something incomprehensible, and half-pulled, half-dragged her out till they stood upon the stairway. To the wedding I must haste away. Yaha! A wonderful high note, full-throated, powerful, hit full in, the middle, a note any singer might be proud of, and with it another sound, the faint tinkle of broken glass. A stray cat darted past them, and in through the flat door. Gillian made a movement, but Mr. Satterthwaite held her back, speaking incoherently. No, no, it's deadly. No smell, nothing to warn you. A mere whiff, and it's all over. Nobody knows quite how deadly it would be. It's unlike anything that's ever been tried before." He was repeating the things that Philip Easter had told him over the table at dinner. Gillian stared at him uncomprehendingly. "Ill." Philip Eastney drew out his watch and looked at it. It was just 11:30. For the past 3/4 of an hour he had been pacing up and down the embankment. He looked out over the Thames and then turned to look into the face of his dinner companion. "That's odd," he said and laughed. "We seem fated to run into each other tonight." "If you call it fate," said Mr. Satterthwaite. Philip Eastney looked at him more attentively, and his own expression changed. "Yes," he said quietly. Mr. Satterthwaite went straight to the point. "I have just come from Miss West's flat." "Yes?" The same voice, with the same deadly quiet. "We have taken a dead cat out of it." There was silence. Then Eastney said, "Who are you?" Mr. Satterthwaite spoke for some time. He recited the whole history of events. "So you see, I was in time," he ended up. He paused and added quite gently, "Have you anything to say?" He expected something, some outburst, some wild justification, but nothing came. "No," said Philip Eastney quietly, and turned on his heel and walked away. Mr. Satterthwaite looked after him till his figure was swallowed up in the gloom. In spite of himself, he had a strange fellow feeling for Eastney, the feeling of an artist for another artist, of a sentimentalist for a real lover, of a plain man for a genius. At last, he roused himself with a start and began to walk in the same direction as Eastney. A fog was beginning to come up. Presently he met a policeman who looked at him suspiciously. "Did you hear a kind of splash just now?" asked the policeman. "No," said Mr. Satterthwaite. The policeman was peering out over the river. "Another of these suicides, I expect," he grunted disconsolately. "They will do it." "I suppose," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "that they have their reasons." "Money, mostly," said the policeman. "Sometimes it's a woman," he said, as he prepared to move away. "It's not always their fault, but some women cause a lot of trouble." "Some women," agreed Mr. Satterthwaite softly. When the policeman had gone on, he sat down on a seat with the fog coming up all around him, and thought about Helen of Troy, and wondered if she were a nice, ordinary woman, blessed or cursed with a wonderful face. Agatha Christie, The Shadow on the Glass. "Listen to this," said Lady Cynthia Drage. She read aloud from the journal she held in her hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Unkerton are entertaining a party at Greenway's house this week. Amongst the guests are Lady Cynthia Drage, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Scott, Major Porter, DSO, Mrs. Staverton, Captain Allinson, and Mr. Satterthwaite." "It's as well," remarked Lady Cynthia, casting away the paper, "to know what we're in for. But they have made a mess of things." Her companion, that same Mr. Satterthwaite whose name figured at the end of the list of guests, looked at her interrogatively. It had been said that if Mr. Satterthwaite were found at the houses of those rich who had newly arrived, it was a sign either that the cooking was unusually good, or that a drama of human life was to be enacted there. Mr. Satterthwaite was abnormally interested in the comedies and tragedies of his fellow men. Lady Cynthia, who was a middle-aged woman with a hard face and a liberal allowance of make-up, tapped him smartly with the newest thing in parasols, which lay rakishly across her knee. "Don't pretend you don't understand me. You do perfectly. What's more, I believe you're here on purpose to see the fur fly." Mr. Satterthwaite protested vigorously. He didn't know what she was talking about. "I'm talking about Richard Scott. Do you pretend you've never heard of him?" "No, of course not. He's the big game man, isn't he?" "That's it. Great big bears and tigers, etc., as the song says. Of course, he's a great lion himself just now. The Unkertons would naturally be mad to get hold of him. And the bride. A charming child. Oh, quite a charming child. But so naive, only 20, you know. And he must be at least 45. "Mrs. Scott seems to be very charming," said Mr. Satterthwaite sedately. "Yes, poor child." "Why, poor child?" Lady Cynthia cast him a look of reproach, and went on, approaching the point at issue in her own manner. Porter's all right. A dull dog, though, another of these African hunters, all sunburnt and silent. Second fiddle to Richard Scott, and always has been. Lifelong friends and all that sort of thing. When I come to think of it, I believe they were together on that trip. Which trip? The trip. The Mrs. Staverton trip. You'll be saying next you've never heard of Mrs. Staverton. I have heard of Mrs. Staverton, said Mr. Satterthwaite, almost with unwillingness. And he and Lady Cynthia exchanged glances. It's so exactly like the Unkertons, wailed the latter. They are absolutely hopeless. Socially, I mean. The idea of asking those two together. Of course they'd heard that Mrs. Staverton was a sportswoman and a traveller and all that, and about her book. People like the Unkertons don't even begin to realize what pitfalls there are. I've been running them myself for the last year, and what I've gone through nobody knows. One has to be constantly at their elbow. Don't do that. You can't do this. Thank goodness I'm through with it now. Not that we've quarrelled. Oh, no, I never quarrel. But somebody else can take on the job. As I've always said, I can put up with vulgarity, but I can't stand meanness. After this somewhat cryptic utterance, Lady Cynthia was silent for a moment, ruminating on the Unkertons' meanness as displayed to herself. If I'd still been running the show for them, she went on presently, I should have said quite firmly and plainly, you can't ask Mrs. Staverton with the Richard Scotts. She and he were once— She stopped eloquently. But were they once? Asked Mr. Satterthwaite. My dear man, it's well known. That trip into the interior. I'm surprised the woman had the face to accept the invitation. Perhaps she didn't know the others were coming, suggested Mr. Satterthwaite. Perhaps she did. That's far more likely. You think— She's what I call a dangerous woman. The sort of woman who'd stick at nothing. I wouldn't be in Richard Scott's shoes this weekend. And his wife knows nothing, you think? I'm certain of it. But I suppose some kind friend will enlighten her sooner or later. Here's Jimmy Allinson. Such a nice boy. He saved my life in Egypt last winter. I was so bored, you know. Hello, Jimmy, come here at once. Captain Allinson obeyed, dropping down on the turf beside her. He was a handsome young fellow of 30, with white teeth and an infectious smile. I'm glad somebody wants me, he observed. The Scots are doing the turtle-dove stunt. 2 required, not 3. Porter's devouring the field, and I've been in mortal danger of being entertained by my hostess. He laughed. Lady Cynthia laughed with him. Mr. Satterthwaite, who was in some ways a little old-fashioned, so much so that he seldom made fun of his host and hostess until after he had left their house, remained grave. Poor Jimmy, said Lady Cynthia. Mine not to reason why, mine but to swiftly fly. I had a barrow escape of being told the family ghost story. An Unkerton ghost, said Lady Cynthia. How screaming! Not an Unkerton ghost, said Mr. Satterthwaite. A Greenways ghost. They bought it with the house. Of course, said Lady Cynthia. I remember now. But it doesn't clank chains, does it? It's only something to do with a window. Jimmy Allinson looked up quickly. A window? But for the moment Mr. Satterthwaite did not answer. He was looking over Jimmy's head at 3 figures approaching from the direction of the house, a slim girl between 2 men. There was a superficial resemblance between the men. Both were tall and dark, with bronzed faces and quick eyes, but looked at more closely the resemblance vanished. Richard Scott, hunter and explorer, was a man of extraordinarily vivid personality. He had a manner that radiated magnetism. John Porter, his friend and fellow hunter, was a man of squarer build, with an impassive, rather wooden face and very thoughtful grey eyes. He was a quiet man, content always to play second fiddle to his friend, and between these two walked Moira Scott, who, until 3 months ago, had been Moira O'Connell. A slender figure, big wistful brown eyes, and golden red hair that stood out round her small face like a saint's halo. That child mustn't be hurt, said Mr. Satterthwaite to himself. It would be abominable that a child like that should be hurt. Lady Cynthia greeted the newcomers with a wave of the latest thing in parasols. Sit down and don't interrupt, she said. Mr. Satterthwaite is telling us a ghost story. "I love ghost stories," said Moira Scott. She dropped down on the grass. "The ghost of Greenway's house?" asked Richard Scott. "Yes, you know about it?" Scott nodded. "I used to stay here in the old days," he explained, "before the Elliots had to sell up. The Watching Cavalier, that's it, isn't it?" "The Watching Cavalier," said his wife softly. "I like that. It sounds interesting. Please go on." But Mr. Satterthwaite seemed somewhat loath to do so. He assured her that it was not really interesting at all. "Now you've done it, Satterthwaite," said Richard Scott sardonically. "That hint of reluctance clinches it." In response to popular clamour, Mr. Satterthwaite was forced to speak. "It's really very uninteresting," he said apologetically. "I believe the original story centres round a Cavalier ancestor of the Elliot family. His wife had a Roundhead lover. The husband was killed by the lover in an upstairs room, and the guilty pair fled. But as they fled, they looked back at the house and saw the face of the dead husband at the window, watching them. That is the legend. But the ghost story is only concerned with a pane of glass in the window of that particular room on which is an irregular stain, almost imperceptible from near at hand, but which from far away certainly gives the effect of a man's face looking out." "Which window is it?" asked Mrs. Scott, looking up at the house. "You can't see it from here," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "It is round the other side, but was boarded up from the inside some years ago, 40 years ago, I think, to be accurate." "What did they do that for? I thought you said the ghost didn't walk." "It doesn't," Mr. Satterthwaite assured her. I suppose there grew to be a superstitious feeling about it, that's all." Then, deftly enough, he succeeded in turning the conversation. Jimmy Allinson was perfectly ready to hold forth upon Egyptian sand diviners. Frauds, most of them, ready enough to tell you vague things about the past, but won't commit themselves as to the future. "I should have thought it was usually the other way about," remarked John Porter. "It's illegal to tell the future in this country, isn't it?" said Richard Scott. "Moira persuaded a gypsy into telling her fortune, but the woman gave her shilling back and said there was nothing doing, or words to that effect." "Perhaps she saw something so frightful that she didn't like to tell it me," said Moira. "Don't pile on the agony, Mrs. Scott," said Allinson lightly. "I, for one, refuse to believe that an unlucky fate is hanging over you." "I wonder," thought Mr. Satterthwaite to himself. "I wonder." Then he looked up sharply. 2 women were coming from the house, a short, stout woman with black hair, inappropriately dressed in jade green, and a tall, slim figure in creamy white. The first woman was his hostess, Mrs. Unkerton. The second was a woman he had often heard of, but never met. "Here's Mrs. Staverton," announced Mrs. Unkerton, in a tone of great satisfaction. "All friends here, I think. These people have an uncanny gift for saying just the most awful things they can," murmured Lady Cynthia, but Mr. Satterthwaite was not listening. He was watching Mrs. Staverton. Very easy, very natural. Her careless, "Hello, Richard. Ages since we met. Sorry I couldn't come to the wedding. Is this your wife? You must be tired of meeting all your husband's weather-beaten old friends." Moira's response, suitable, rather shy. The elder woman's swift appraising glance that went on lightly to another old friend. "Hello, John." The same easy tone, but with a subtle difference in it, a warming quality that had been absent before. And then that sudden smile. It transformed her. Lady Cynthia had been quite right. A dangerous woman, very fair, deep blue eyes, not the traditional colouring of the siren, a face almost haggard in repose. A woman with a slow, dragging voice and a sudden, dazzling smile. Iris Staverton sat down. She became naturally and inevitably the centre of the group. So you felt it would always be. Mr. Satterthwaite was recalled from his thoughts by Major Porter's suggesting a stroll. Mr. Satterthwaite, who was not as a general rule much given to strolling, acquiesced. The 2 men sauntered off together across the lawn. "Very interesting story of yours just now," said the Major. "I will show you the window," said Mr. Satterthwaite. He led the way round to the west side of the house. Here there was a small formal garden, the Privy Garden it was always called, and there was some point in the name, for it was surrounded by high holly hedges, and even the entrance to it ran zigzag between the same high prickly hedges. Once inside, it was very charming, with an old-world charm of formal flower beds, flagged paths, and a low stone seat, exquisitely carved. When they had reached the centre of the garden, Mr. Satterthwaite turned and pointed up at the house. The length of Greenway's house ran north and south. In this narrow west wall there was only one window, a window on the first floor, almost overgrown by ivy, with grimy panes, and which you could just see was boarded up on the inside. "There you are," said Mr. Satterthwaite. Craning his neck a little, Porter looked up. I can see a kind of discoloration on one of the panes, nothing more." "We're too near," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "There's a clearing higher up in the woods where you get a really good view." He led the way out of the Privy Garden, and turning sharply to the left, struck into the woods. A certain enthusiasm of showmanship possessed him, and he hardly noticed that the man at his side was absent and inattentive. "They had, of course, to make another window when they boarded up this one," he explained. "The new one faces south, overlooking the lawn where we were sitting just now. I rather fancy the Scores have the room in question. That is why I didn't want to pursue the subject. Mrs. Scott might have felt nervous if she had realized that she was sleeping in what might be called the haunted room." "Yes, I see," said Porter. Mr. Satterthwaite looked at him sharply, and realized that the other had not heard a word of what he was saying. "Very interesting," said Porter. He slashed with his stick at some tall foxgloves, and frowning he said, "She ought not to have come. She ought never to have come." People often spoke after this fashion to Mr. Satterthwaite. He seemed to matter so little, to have so negative a personality. He was merely a glorified listener. "No," said Porter, "she ought never to have come." Mr. Satterthwaite knew instinctively that it was not of Mrs. Scott he spoke. "You think not?" he asked. Porter shook his head as though in foreboding. "I was on that trip," he said abruptly. "The three of us went, Scott and I and Iris. She's a wonderful woman, and a damned fine shot." He paused. "What made them ask her?" He finished abruptly. Mr. Satterthwaite shrugged his shoulders. "Ignorance," he said. "There's going to be trouble," said the other. "We must stand by and do what we can." "But surely Mrs. Staverton—" "I'm talking of Scott." He paused. "You see, there's Mrs. Scott to consider." Mr. Satterthwaite had been considering her all along, but he did not think it necessary to say so, since the other man had so clearly forgotten her until this minute. "How did Scott meet his wife?" he asked. "Last winter in Cairo. A quick business. They were engaged in 3 weeks and married in 6. "She seems to me very charming." "She is, no doubt about it. And he adores her. But that will make no difference." And again Major Porter repeated to himself, using the pronoun that meant to him one person only, "Hang it all, she shouldn't have come." Just then they stepped out upon a high grassy knoll at some little distance from the house. With again something of the pride of the showman, Mr. Satterthwaite stretched out his arm. "Look," he said. It was fast growing dusk. The window could still be plainly descried, and apparently pressed against one of the panes was a man's face surmounted by a plumed cavalier's hat. "Very curious," said Porter. "Really very curious. What will happen when that pane of glass gets smashed some day?" Mr. Satterthwaite smiled. "That is one of the most interesting parts of the story. That pane of glass has been replaced to my certain knowledge at least 11 times, perhaps oftener. The last time was 12 years ago, when the then owner of the house determined to destroy the myth. But it's always the same. The stain reappears, not all at once. The discoloration spreads gradually. It takes a month or 2 as a rule." For the first time, Porter showed signs of real interest. He gave a sudden quick shiver. "Damned odd, these things. No accounting for them. What's the real reason of having the room boarded up inside?" "Well, an idea got about that the room was unlucky. The Eveshams were in it just before the divorce. Then Stanley and his wife were staying here and had that room when he ran off with his chorus girl." Porter raised his eyebrows. I see. Danger, not to life, but to morals. And now, thought Mr. Satterthwaite to himself, the Scots have it. I wonder. They retraced their steps in silence to the house. Walking almost noiselessly on the soft turf, each absorbed in his own thoughts, they became unwittingly eavesdroppers. They were rounding the corner of the holly hedge when they heard Iris Staverton's voice raised fierce and clear from the depths of the privy garden. "You shall be sorry for this!" Scott's voice answered low and uncertain, so that the words could not be distinguished. And then the woman's voice rose again, speaking words that they were to remember later. "Jealousy! It drives one to the devil! It is the devil! It can drive one to black murder! Be careful, Richard, for God's sake, be careful!" And then on that, she had come out of the privy garden ahead of them, and on round the corner of the house without seeing them, walking swiftly, almost running, like a woman hag-ridden and pursued. Mr. Satterthwaite thought again of Lady Cynthia's words. A dangerous woman. For the first time he had a premonition of tragedy, coming swift and inexorable, not to be gainsaid. Yet that evening he felt ashamed of his fears. Everything seemed normal and pleasant. Mrs. Staverton, with her easy insouciance, showed no sign of strain. Moira Scott was her charming, unaffected self. The two women appeared to be getting on very well. Richard Scott himself seemed to be in boisterous spirits. The most worried-looking person was stout Mrs. Unkerton. She confided at length in Mr. Satterthwaite. "Think it's silly or not as you like, there's something giving me the creeps. And I'll tell you frankly, I've sent for the glazier unbeknown to Ned." "The glazier? To put a new pane of glass in that window. It's all very well. Ned's proud of it, says it gives the house a tone I don't like it. I tell you flat, we'll have a nice plain modern pane of glass with no nasty stories attached to it." "You forget," said Mr. Satterthwaite, "or perhaps you don't know. The stain comes back." "That's as it may be," said Mrs. Unkerton. "All I can say is if it does, it's against nature." Mr. Satterthwaite raised his eyebrows but did not reply. "And what if it does?" pursued Mrs. Unkerton defiantly. "We're not so bankrupt, Ned and I, that we can't afford a new pane of glass every month, or every week if need be for the matter of that." Mr. Satterthwaite did not meet the challenge. He had seen too many things crumple and fall before the power of money to believe that even a cavalier ghost could put up a successful fight. Nevertheless, he was interested by Mrs. Unkerton's manifest uneasiness. Even she was not exempt from the tension in the atmosphere, only she attributed it to an attenuated ghost story, not to the clash of personalities amongst her guests. Mr. Satterthwaite was fated to hear yet another scrap of conversation which threw light upon the situation. He was going up the wide staircase to bed. John Porter and Mrs. Staverton were sitting together in an alcove of the big hall. She was speaking with a faint irritation in her golden voice. "I hadn't the least idea the Scots were going to be here. I dare say, if I had known, I shouldn't have come. But I can assure you, my dear John, that now I am here, I'm not going to run away." Mr. Satterthwaite passed on up the staircase out of earshot. He thought to himself, "I wonder now, how much of that is true? Did she know? I wonder, what's going to come of it?" He shook his head. In the clear light of the morning he felt that he had perhaps been a little melodramatic in his imaginings of the evening before. A moment of strain, yes, certainly, inevitable under the circumstances, but nothing more. People adjusted themselves. His fancy that some great catastrophe was pending was nerves, pure nerves, or possibly liver. Yes, that was it, liver. He was due at Carlsbad in another fortnight. On his own account he proposed a little stroll that evening just as it was growing dusk. He suggested to Major Porter that they should go up to the clearing and see if Mrs. Unkerton had been as good as her word and had a new pane of glass put in. To himself he said, "Exercise, that's what I need. Exercise." The two men walked slowly through the woods. Porter, as usual, was taciturn. "I can't help feeling," said Mr. Satterthwaite loquaciously, "that we were a little foolish in our imaginings yesterday, expecting, trouble, you know. After all, people have to behave themselves, swallow their feelings and that sort of thing." "Perhaps," said Porter. After a minute or two he added, "Civilized people." "You mean, people who've lived outside civilization a good deal sometimes go back. Revert, whatever you call it." They emerged onto the grassy knoll. Mr. Satterthwaite was breathing rather fast. He never enjoyed going uphill. He looked towards the window. The face was still there, more lifelike than ever. "Our hostess has repented, I see." Porter threw it only a cursory glance. "Unkerton cut up rough, I expect," he said indifferently. "He's the sort of man who is willing to be proud of another family's ghost, and who isn't going to run the risk of having it driven away when he's paid spot cash for it." He was silent a minute or two, staring, not at the house, but at the thick undergrowth by which they were surrounded. "Has it ever struck you," he said, "that civilization's damn dangerous?" "Dangerous?" Such a revolutionary remark shocked Mr. Satterthwaite to the core. "Yes. There are no safety valves, you see." He turned abruptly, and they descended the path by which they had come. "I really am quite at a loss to understand you," said Mr. Satterthwaite, pattering along with nimble steps to keep up with the other's strides. "Reasonable people." Porter laughed, a short, disconcerting laugh. Then he looked at the correct little gentleman by his side. "You think it's all bunkum on my part, Mr. Satterthwaite, but there are people, you know, who can tell you when a storm's coming. They feel it beforehand in the air, and other people can foretell trouble. There's trouble coming now, Mr. Satterthwaite, big trouble. It may come any minute. It may—" He stopped dead, clutching Mr. Satterthwaite's arm, and in that tense minute of silence it came, the sound of 2 shots and following them a cry in a woman's voice. "My God!" cried Porter. "It's come!" He raced down the path, Mr. Satterthwaite panting behind him. In a minute they came out onto the lawn, close by the hedge of the privy garden. At the same time, Richard Scott and Mr. Unkerton came round the opposite corner of the house. They halted, facing each other, to left and right of the entrance to the privy garden. It came from in there," said Unkerton, pointing with a flabby hand. "We must see," said Porter. He led the way into the enclosure. As he rounded the last bend of the holly hedge, he stopped dead. Mr. Satterthwaite peered over his shoulder. A loud cry burst from Richard Scott. There were 3 people in the privy garden. 2 of them lay on the grass near the stone seat, a man and a woman. The third was Mrs. Staverton. She was standing quite close to them by the holly hedge, gazing with horror-stricken eyes and holding something in her right hand. "Iris!" cried Porter. "Iris! For God's sake, what's that you've got in your hand?" She looked down at it then, with a kind of wonder, an unbelievable indifference. "It's a pistol," she said wonderingly. And then, after what seemed an interminable time but was in reality only a few seconds, "I picked it up." Mr. Satterthwaite had gone forward to where Unkerton and Scott were kneeling on the turf. "A doctor," the latter was murmuring. "We must have a doctor." But it was too late for any doctor. Jimmy Allenson, who had complained that the sand diviners hedged about the future, and Moira Scott, to whom the gypsy had returned a shilling, lay there in the last great stillness. It was Richard Scott who completed a brief examination. The iron nerve of the man showed in this crisis. After the first cry of agony, he was himself again. He laid his wife gently down again. "Shot from behind," he said briefly. "The bullet has passed right through her." Then he handled Jimmy Allenson. The wound here was in the breast, and the bullet was lodged in the body. John Porter came towards them. "Nothing should be touched," he said sternly. "The police must see it all exactly as it is now." "The police?" said Richard Scott. His eyes lit up with a sudden flame as he looked at the woman standing by the holly hedge. He made a step in that direction, but at the same time John Porter also moved, so as to bar his way. For a moment it seemed as though there was a duel of eyes between the 2 friends. Porter very quietly shook his head. "No, Richard," he said. "It looks like it, but you're wrong." Richard Scott spoke with difficulty, moistening his dry lips. "Then why— has she got that in her hand?" And again, Iris Staverton said in the same lifeless tone, "I picked it up." "The police," said Unkerton, rising. "We must send for the police at once. You will telephone, perhaps, Scott?" "Someone should stay here. Yes, I am sure someone should stay here." In his quiet, gentlemanly manner, Mr. Satterthwaite offered to do so. His host accepted the offer with manifest relief. "The ladies," he explained. "I must break the news to the ladies, Lady Cynthia and my dear wife." Mr. Satterthwaite stayed in the privy garden looking down on the body of that which had once been Moira Scott. "Poor child," he said to himself. "Poor child." He quoted to himself the tag about the evil men do living after them. For was not Richard Scott in a way responsible for his innocent wife's death? They would hang Iris Staverton, he supposed. Not that he liked to think of it, but was not it at least a part of the blame he laid at the man's door? The evil that men do— and the girl, the innocent girl, had paid. He looked down at her with a very deep pity. Her small face, so white and wistful, a half-smile on the lips still. The ruffled golden hair, the delicate ear. There was a spot of blood on the lobe of it. With an inner feeling of being something of a detective, Mr. Satterthwaite deduced an earring, torn away in her fall. He craned his neck forward. Yes, he was right. There was a small pearl drop hanging from the other ear. Poor child. Poor child. "And now, sir," said Inspector Winkfield. They were in the library. The inspector, a shrewd-looking, forceful man of 40-odd, was concluding his investigations. He had questioned most of the guests, and had by now pretty well made up his mind on the case. He was listening to what Major Porter and Mr. Satterthwaite had to say. Mr. Unkerton sat heavily in a chair, staring with protruding eyes at the opposite wall. "As I understand it, gentlemen," said the inspector, "you'd been for a walk. You were returning to the house by a path that winds round the left side of what they call the privy garden. Is that correct?" "Quite correct, Inspector." "You heard 2 shots and a woman's scream?" "Yes." "You then ran as fast as you could, emerged from the woods and made your way to the entrance of the privy garden. If anybody had left that garden, they could only do so by one entrance. The holly bushes are impassable. If anyone had run out of the garden and turned to the right, he would have been met by Mr. Unkerton and Mr. Scott. If he had turned to the left, he could not have done so without being seen by you. Is that right?" "That is so," said Major Porter. His face was very white. "That seems to settle it," said the inspector. "Mr. and Mrs. Unkerton and Lady Cynthia Drage were sitting on the lawn. Mr. Scott was in the billiard-room which opens on to that lawn. At 6 minutes past 6, Mrs. Staverton came out of the house, spoke a word or two to those sitting there, and went round the corner of the house towards the privy garden. 2 minutes later, the shots were heard. Mr. Scott rushed out of the house, and together with Mr. Unkerton ran to the privy garden. At the same time, you and Mr. Satterthwaite arrived from the opposite direction. Mrs. Staverton was in the privy garden with a pistol in her hand, from which 2 shots had been fired. As I see it, she shot the lady first from behind as she was sitting on the bench. Then Captain Allinson sprang up and went for her, and she shot him in the chest as he came towards her. I understand that there had been a previous attachment between her and Mr. Richard Scott." "That's a damned lie," said Porter. His voice rang out hoarse and defiant. The inspector said nothing, merely shook his head. "What is her own story?" asked Mr. Satterthwaite. "She says that she went into the privy garden to be quiet for a little. Just before she rounded the last hedge, she heard the shots. She came round the corner, saw the pistol lying at her feet and picked it up. No one passed her, and she saw no one in the garden but the 2 victims." The inspector gave an eloquent pause. "That's what she says, and although I cautioned her, she insisted on making a statement." "If she said that," said Major Porter, and his face was still deadly white, "she was speaking the truth. I know Iris Staverton." "Well, sir," said the inspector, "there'll be plenty of time to go into all that later. In the meantime, I've got my duty to do." With an abrupt movement, Porter turned to Mr. Satterthwaite. "You? Can't you help? Can't you do something?" Mr. Satterthwaite could not help feeling immensely flattered. He had been appealed to, most insignificant of men, and by a man like John Porter. He was just about to flutter out a regretful reply when the butler, Thompson, entered, with a card upon a salver which he took to his master with an apologetic cough. Mr. Unkerton was still sitting huddled up in a chair, taking no part in the proceedings. "I told the gentleman you would probably not be able to see him, sir," said Thompson, "but he insisted that he had an appointment and that it was most urgent." Unkerton took the card. "Mr. Harley Quinn," he read. "I remember he was to see me about a picture. I did make an appointment, but as things are—" But Mr. Satterthwaite had started forward. "Mr. Harley Quinn, did you say?" he cried. "How extraordinary! How very extraordinary! Major Porter, you asked me if I could help you. I think I can. This Mr. Quinn is a friend, or I should say an acquaintance of mine. He is a most remarkable man." "One of these amateur solvers of crime, I suppose?" remarked the inspector disparagingly. "No," said Mr. Satterthwaite. "He is not that kind of man at all, but he has a power, an almost uncanny power, of showing you what you have seen with your own eyes, of making clear to you what you have heard with your own ears. Let us, at any rate, give him an outline of the case, and hear what he has to say." Mr. Unkerton glanced at the inspector, who merely snorted and looked at the ceiling. Then the former gave a short nod to Thompson, who left the room and returned, ushering in a tall, slim stranger. "Mr. Unkerton?" The stranger shook him by the hand. "I am sorry to intrude upon you at such a time. We must leave our little picture chat until another time. Ah, my friend Mr. Satterthwaite. Still as fond of the drama as ever?" A faint smile played for a minute round the stranger's lips as he said these last words. "Mr. Quinn," said Mr. Satterthwaite impressively, "we have a drama here. We are in the midst of one, I should like, and my friend Major Porter would like to have your opinion of it." Mr. Quinn sat down. The red-shaded lamp threw a broad band of coloured light over the checked pattern of his overcoat, and left his face in shadow almost as though he wore a mask. Succinctly, Mr. Satterthwaite recited the main points of the tragedy. Then he paused, breathlessly awaiting the words of the oracle. But Mr. Quinn merely shook his head. "A sad story," he said. "A very sad and shocking tragedy. The lack of motive makes it very intriguing." Unkerton stared at him. "You don't understand," he said. "Mrs. Staverton was heard to threaten Richard Scott. She was bitterly jealous of his wife. Jealousy—" "I agree," said Mr. Quinn. "Jealousy or demoniac possession. It's all the same. But you misunderstand me. I was not referring to the murder of Mrs. Scott, but to that of Captain Allinson." "You're right," cried Porter, springing forward. "There's a flaw there. If Iris had ever contemplated shooting Mrs. Scott, she'd have got her alone somewhere. No, we're on the wrong tack, and I think I see another solution. Only those 3 people went into the Privy Garden. That is indisputable, and I don't intend to dispute it. But I reconstruct the tragedy differently. Supposing Jimmy Allinson shoots first Mrs. Scott and then himself. That's possible, isn't it? He flings the pistol from him as he falls. Mrs. Staverton finds it lying on the ground and picks it up just as she said. How's that?" The inspector shook his head. "Won't wash, Major Porter. If Captain Allinson had fired that shot close to his body, the cloth would have been singed." "He might have held the pistol at arm's length." "Why should he? No sense in it. Besides, there's no motive." "Might have gone off his head suddenly," muttered Porter, but without any great conviction. He fell to silence again, suddenly rousing himself to say defiantly, "Well, Mr. Quinn?" The latter shook his head. "I'm not a magician. I'm not even a criminologist. But I will tell you one thing. I believe in the value of impressions. In any time of crisis, there is always one moment that stands out from all the others, one picture that remains when all else has faded. Mr. Satterthwaite is, I think, likely to have been the most unprejudiced observer of those present. Will you cast your mind back, Mr. Satterthwaite, and tell us the moment that made the strongest impression on you? Was it when you heard the shots? Was it when you first saw the dead bodies? Was it when you first observed the pistol in Mrs. Staverton's hand? Clear your mind of any preconceived standard of values, and tell us. Mr. Satterthwaite fixed his eyes on Mr. Quinn's face, rather as a schoolboy might repeat a lesson of which he was not sure. No, he said slowly, it was not any of those. The moment that I shall always remember was when I stood alone by the bodies, afterwards looking down on Mrs. Scott. She was lying on her side. Her hair was ruffled. There was a spot of blood on her little ear. And instantly, as he said it, he felt that he had said a terrific, a significant thing. Blood on her ear? Yes, I remember, said Unkerton slowly. Her earring must have been torn out when she fell, explained Mr. Satterthwaite. But it sounded a little improbable as he said it. She was lying on her left side, said Porter. I suppose it was that ear? No, said Mr. Satterthwaite quickly. It was her right ear. The inspector coughed. I found this in the grass, he vouchsafed. He held up a loop of gold wire. But my God, man, cried Porter. The thing can't have been wrenched to pieces by a mere fall. It's more as though it had been shot away by a bullet. So it was, cried Mr. Satterthwaite. It was a bullet. It must have been. There were only 2 shots, said the inspector. A shot can't have grazed her ear and shot her in the back as well, and if one shot carried away the earring, and the second shot killed her, it can't have killed Captain Allinson as well, not unless he was standing close in front of her, very close, facing her, as it might be. Oh, I know, not even then, unless, that is— Unless she was in his arms, you were going to say, said Mr. Quinn with a queer little smile. Well, why not? Everyone stared at each other. The idea was so vitally strange to them. Allinson and Mrs. Scott. Mr. Unkerton voiced the same feeling. But they hardly knew each other, he said. I don't know, said Mr. Satterthwaite thoughtfully. They might have known each other better than we thought. Lady Cynthia said he saved her from being bored in Egypt last winter, and you— he turned to Porter— you told me that Richard Scott met his wife in Cairo last winter. They might have known each other very well indeed out there. They didn't seem to be together much, said Unkerton. No, they rather avoided each other. It was almost unnatural, now I come to think of it. They all looked at Mr. Quinn, as if a little startled at the conclusions at which they had arrived so unexpectedly. Mr. Quinn rose to his feet. You see, he said, what Mr. Satterthwaite's impression has done for us. He turned to Unkerton. It is your turn now. Eh? I don't understand you. You were very thoughtful when I came into this room. I should like to know exactly what thought it was that obsessed you. Never mind if it has nothing to do with the tragedy. Never mind if it seems to you superstitious. Mr. Unkerton started, ever so slightly. Tell us. I don't mind telling you, said Unkerton, though it's nothing to do with the business, and you'll probably laugh at me into the bargain. I was wishing that my missus had left well alone and not replaced that pane of glass in the haunted window. I feel as though doing that has maybe brought a curse upon us. He was unable to understand why the 2 men opposite him stared so. But she hasn't replaced it yet, said Mr. Satterthwaite at last. Yes, she has. Man came first thing this morning. My God, said Porter, I begin to understand. That room, it's panelled, I suppose, not papered. Yes, but what does that— But Porter had swung out of the room. The other followed him. He went straight upstairs to the Scots' bedroom. It was a charming room, panelled in cream with 2 windows facing south. Porter felt with his hands along the panels on the western wall. There's a spring somewhere. Must be. Ah! There was a click, and a section of the panelling rolled back. It disclosed the grimy panes of the haunted window. One pane of glass was clean and new. Porter stooped quickly and picked up something. He held it out on the palm of his hand. It was a fragment of ostrich feather. Then he looked at Mr. Quinn. Mr. Quinn nodded. He went across to the hat cupboard in the bedroom. There were several hats in it, the dead woman's hats. He took out one with a large brim and curling feathers, an elaborate ascot hat. Mr. Quinn began speaking in a gentle, reflective voice. "Let us suppose," said Mr. Quinn, "a man who is by nature intensely jealous. A man who has stayed here in bygone years and knows the secret of the spring in the panelling. To amuse himself, he opens it one day and looks out over the privy garden. There, secure as they think from being overlooked, he sees his wife and another man. There can be no possible doubt in his mind as to the relations between them. He is mad with rage. What shall he do? An idea comes to him. He goes to the cupboard and puts on the hat with the brim and feathers. It is growing dusk, and he remembers the story of the stain on the glass. Anyone looking up at the window will see, as they think, the watching cavalier. Thus secure he watches them, and at the moment they are clasped in each other's arms, he shoots. He is a good shot, a wonderful shot. As they fall, he fires once more. That shot carries away the earring. He flings the pistol out of the window into the privy garden, rushes downstairs and out through the billiard room." Porter took a step towards him. "But he let her be accused," he cried. "He stood by and let her be accused. Why? Why?" "I think I know why," said Mr. Quinn. "I should guess. It's only guesswork on my part, mind. That Richard Scott was once madly in love with Iris Staverton, so madly that even meeting her years afterwards stirred up the embers of jealousy again. I should say that Iris Staverton once fancied that she might love him, that she went on a hunting trip with him and another, and that she came back in love with the better man." "The better man," muttered Porter, dazed. "You mean—" "Yes," said Mr. Quinn with a faint smile. "I mean you." He paused a minute and then said, "If I were you, I should go to her now." "I will," said Porter. He turned and left the room. Agatha Christie, The Affair of the Pink Pearl. "What on earth are you doing?" demanded Tuppence, as she entered the inner sanctum of the International Detective Agency, Slogan Blunt's brilliant detectives, and discovered her lord and master prone on the floor in a sea of books. Tommy struggled to his feet. "I was trying to arrange these books on the top shelf of that cupboard," he complained, "and the damned chair gave way." "What are they, anyway?" asked Tuppence, picking up a volume. "The Hound of the Baskervilles. I wouldn't mind reading that again sometime." "You see the idea," said Tommy, dusting himself with care. "Half hours with the great masters, that sort of thing. You see, Tuppence, I can't help feeling that we are more or less amateurs at this business. Of course, amateurs in one sense we cannot help being, but it would do no harm to acquire the technique, so to speak. These books are detective stories by the leading masters of the art. I intend to try different styles and compare results." Said Tuppence. "I often wonder how those detectives would have got on in real life." She picked up another volume. "You'll find a difficulty in being a Thorndyke. You've no medical experience and less legal, and I never heard that science was your strong point." "Perhaps not," said Tommy. "But at any rate I've bought a very good camera, and I shall photograph footprints and enlarge the negatives and all that sort of thing. Now, mon ami, use your little grey cells. What does this convey to you?" He pointed to the bottom shelf of the cupboard. On it lay a somewhat futuristic dressing gown, a Turkish slipper, and a violin. "Obvious, my dear Watson," said Tuppence. "Exactly," said Tommy. "The Sherlock Holmes touch." He took up the violin and drew the bow idly across the strings, causing Tuppence to give a wail of agony. At that moment the buzzer rang on the desk, a sign that a client had arrived in the outer office and was being held in parley by Albert, the office boy. Tommy hastily replaced the violin in the cupboard and kicked the books behind the desk. "Not that there's any great hurry," he remarked. "Albert will be handing them out the stuff about my being engaged with Scotland Yard on the phone. Get into your office and start typing, Tuppence. It makes the office sound busy and active. No, on second thoughts, you shall be taking notes in shorthand from my dictation. Let's have a look before we get Albert to send the victim in." They approached the peephole, which had been artistically contrived so as to command a view of the outer office. The client was a girl of about Tuppence's age, tall and dark, with a rather haggard face and scornful eyes. "Clothes cheap and striking," remarked Tuppence. "Have her in, Tommy." In another minute the girl was shaking hands with the celebrated Mr. Blunt, whilst Tuppence sat by with eyes demurely downcast and pad and pencil in hand. "My confidential secretary, Miss Robinson," said Mr. Blunt with a wave of the hand. "You may speak freely before her." Then he lay back for a minute, half-closed his eyes, and remarked in a tired tone, "You must find travelling in a bus very crowded at this time of day." "I came in a taxi," said the girl. "Oh," said Tommy, aggrieved. His eyes rested reproachfully on a blue bus ticket protruding from her glove. The girl's eyes followed his glance, and she smiled and drew it out. "You mean this? I picked it up on the pavement. A little neighbour of ours collects them." Tuppence coughed, and Tommy threw a baleful glare at her. "We must get to business," he said briskly. "You are in need of our services, miss." "Kingston Bruce is my name," said the girl. "We live at Wimbledon. Last night a lady who is staying with us lost a valuable pink pearl. Mr. St. Vincent was also dining with us, and during dinner he happened to mention your firm. My mother sent me off to you this morning to ask you if you would look into the matter for us." The girl spoke sullenly, almost disagreeably. It was clear as daylight that she and her mother had not agreed over the matter. She was here under protest. "I see," said Tommy, a little puzzled. "You have not called in the police." "No," said Miss Kingston Bruce. "We haven't. It would be idiotic to call in the police and then find that the silly thing had rolled under the fireplace or something like that." "Oh," said Tommy. "Then the jewel may only be lost after all." Miss Kingston Bruce shrugged her shoulders. "People make such a fuss about things," she murmured. Tommy cleared his throat. "Of course," he said doubtfully. "I am extremely busy just now." "I quite understand," said the girl, rising to her feet. There was a quick gleam of satisfaction in her eyes, which Tuppence, for one, did not miss. "Nevertheless," continued Tommy, "I think I can manage to run down to Wimbledon. Will you give me the address, please?" "The Laurels, Edgeworth Road." "Make a note of it, please, Miss Robinson." Miss Kingston Bruce hesitated, then said rather ungraciously, "We'll expect you then. Good morning." "Funny girl," said Tommy. "I couldn't quite make her out." "I wonder if she stole the thing herself," remarked Tuppence meditatively. "Come on, Tommy, let's put away these books and take the car and go down there. By the way, who are you going to be, Sherlock Holmes still?" "I think I need practice for that," said Tommy. "I came rather a cropper over that bus ticket, didn't I?" "You did," said Tuppence. "If I were you, I shouldn't try too much on that girl. She's as sharp as a needle. She's unhappy too, poor devil." "I suppose you know all about her already," said Tommy with sarcasm, simply from looking at the shape of her nose. "I'll tell you my idea of what we shall find at the Laurels," said Tuppence, quite unmoved. "A household of snobs, very keen to move in the best society. The father, if there is a father, is sure to have a military title. The girl falls in with their way of life and despises herself for doing so." Tommy took a last look at the books now neatly ranged upon a shelf. "I think," he said thoughtfully, "that I shall be Thorndyke today." "I shouldn't have thought there was anything medico-legal about this case," remarked Tuppence. "Perhaps not," said Tommy, "but I'm simply dying to use that new camera of mine. It's supposed to have the most marvellous lens that ever was or ever could be." "I know those kind of lenses," said Tuppence. "By the time you've adjusted the shutter and stopped down and calculated the exposure and kept your eyes on the spirit level, your brain gives out, and you yearn for the simple brownie. Only an unambitious soul is content with the simple brownie. Well, I bet I shall get better results with it than you will." Tommy ignored this challenge. "I ought to have a smoker's companion," he said regretfully. "I wonder where one buys them." "There's always the patent corkscrew Aunt Araminta gave you last Xmas," said Tuppence helpfully. "That's true," said Tommy. "A curious-looking engine of destruction, I thought it at the time, and rather a humorous present to get from a strictly teetotal aunt." "I," said Tuppence. "Shelby Polton." Tommy looked at her scornfully. "Polton, indeed! You couldn't begin to do one of the things that he does." "Yes, I can," said Tuppence. "I can rub my hands together when—" "I'm pleased. That's quite enough to get on with. I hope you're going to take plaster casts of footprints." Tommy was reduced to silence. Having collected the corkscrew, they went round to the garage, got out the car, and started for Wimbledon. The Laurels was a big house. It ran somewhat to gables and turrets, had an air of being very newly painted, and was surrounded with neat flower beds filled with scarlet geraniums. A tall man with a close-cropped white moustache and an exaggeratedly martial bearing opened the door before Tommy had time to ring. "I've been looking out for you," he explained fussily. "Mr. Blunt, is it not? I am Colonel Kingston Bruce. Will you come into my study?" He led them into a small room at the back of the house. "Young St. Vincent was telling me wonderful things about your firm. I've noticed your advertisements myself. This guaranteed 24-hour service of yours a marvellous notion. That's exactly what I need." Inwardly anathematizing Tuppence for her irresponsibility in inventing this brilliant detail, Tommy replied, "Just so, Colonel." "The whole thing is most distressing, sir. Most distressing." "Perhaps you would kindly give me the facts," said Tommy with a hint of impatience. "Certainly I will at once. We have at the present moment staying with us a very old and dear friend of ours, Lady Laura Barton, daughter of the late Earl of Carroway. The present Earl, her brother, made a striking speech in the House of Lords the other day. As I say, she is an old and dear friend of ours. Some American friends of mine who have just come over, the Hamilton Betts, were most anxious to meet her." "Nothing easier," I said. "She is staying with me now. Come down for the weekend. You know what Americans are about titles, Mr. Blunt. And others besides Americans sometimes, Colonel Kingston Bruce." "Alas, only too true, my dear sir. Nothing I hate more than a snob. Well, as I was saying, the Betts came down for the weekend. Last night we were playing bridge at the time. The clasp of a pendant Mrs. Hamilton Betts was wearing broke, so she took it off and laid it down on a small table, meaning to take it upstairs with her when she went. This, however, she forgot to do. I must explain, Mr. Blunt, that the pendant consisted of 2 small diamond wings and a big pink pearl depending from them. The pendant was found this morning lying where Mrs. Betts had left it, but the pearl, a pearl of enormous value, had been wrenched off. Who found the pendant? The parlour-maid Gladys Hill. Any reason to suspect her? She has been with us some years, and we have always found her perfectly honest. But of course one never knows." "Exactly. Will you describe your staff, and also tell me who was present at dinner last night?" "There is the cook. She has been with us only 2 months, but then she would have no occasion to go near the drawing-room. The same applies to the kitchen-maid. Then there is the housemaid, Alice Cummings. She also has been with us for some years, and Lady Laura's maid, of course. She is French." Colonel Kingston Bruce looked very impressive as he said this. Tommy, unaffected by the revelation of the maid's nationality, said, "Exactly. And the party at dinner?" "Mr. and Mrs. Betts, ourselves, my wife and daughter, and Lady Laura. Young St. Vincent was dining with us, and Mr. Rennie looked in after dinner for a while." "Who is Mr. Rennie?" "A most pestilential fellow, an arrant socialist. Good-looking, of course, and with a certain specious power of argument. But a man, I don't mind telling you, whom I wouldn't trust a yard, a dangerous sort of fellow." "In fact," said Tommy dryly, "it is Mr. Rennie whom you suspect?" "I do, Mr. Blunt. I'm sure, holding the views he does, that he can have no principles whatsoever. What could have been easier for him than to have quietly wrenched off the pearl at a moment when we were all absorbed in our game?" There were several absorbing moments, a redoubled no-trump hand, I remember, and also a painful argument when my wife had the misfortune to revoke. "Quite so," said Tommy. "I should just like to know one thing. What is Mrs. Betts' attitude in all this?" "She wanted me to call in the police," said Colonel Kingston Bruce reluctantly. "That is, when we had searched everywhere in case the pearl had only dropped off." "But you dissuaded her?" I was very averse to the idea of publicity, and my wife and daughter backed me up. Then my wife remembered young St. Vincent speaking about your firm at dinner last night, and the 24 hours special service. Yes, said Tommy with a heavy heart. You see, in any case, no harm will be done. If we call in the police tomorrow, it can be supposed that we thought the jewel merely lost and were hunting for it. By the way, nobody has been allowed to leave the house this morning. Except your daughter, of course, said Tuppence, speaking for the first time. Except my daughter, agreed the Colonel. She volunteered at once to go and put the case before you. Tommy rose. We will do our best to give you satisfaction, Colonel, he said. I should like to see the drawing-room and the table on which the pendant was laid down. I should also like to ask Mrs. Betts a few questions. After that, I will interview the servants, or rather my assistant, Miss Robinson, will do so. He felt his nerve quailing before the terrors of questioning the servants. Colonel Kingston Bruce threw open the door and led them across the hall. As he did so, a remark came to them clearly through the open door of the room they were approaching, and the voice that uttered it was that of the girl who had come to see them that morning. You know perfectly well, Mother, she was saying, that she did bring home a teaspoon in her muff. In another minute they were being introduced to Mrs. Kingston Bruce, a plaintive lady with a languid manner. Miss Kingston Bruce acknowledged their presence with a short inclination of the head. Her face was more sullen than ever. Mrs. Kingston Bruce was voluble. But I know who I think took it, she ended. That dreadful socialist young man. He loves the Russians and the Germans and hates the English. What else can you expect? He never touched it, said Miss Kingston Bruce fiercely. I was watching him all the time. I couldn't have failed to see if he had. She looked at them defiantly with her chin up. Tommy created a diversion by asking for an interview with Mrs. Betts. When Mrs. Kingston Bruce had departed, accompanied by her husband and daughter to find Mrs. Betts, he whistled thoughtfully. I wonder, he said gently, who it was who had a teaspoon in her muff. Just what I was thinking, replied Tuppence. Mrs. Betts, followed by her husband, burst into the room. She was a big woman with a determined voice. Mr. Hamilton Betts looked dyspeptic and subdued. I understand, Mr. Blunt, that you are a private inquiry agent and one who hustles things through at a great rate? Hustle, said Tommy, is my middle name Mrs. Betts. Let me ask you a few questions. Thereafter things proceeded rapidly. Tommy was shown the damaged pendant, the table on which it had lain, and Mr. Betts emerged from his taciturnity to mention the value, in dollars, of the stolen pearl. And withal, Tommy felt an irritating certainty that he was not getting on. I think that will do, he said at length. Miss Robinson, will you kindly fetch the special photographic apparatus from the hall? Miss Robinson complied. A little invention of my own, said Tommy. In appearance, you see, it is just like an ordinary camera. He had some slight satisfaction in seeing that the Betts were impressed. He photographed the pendant, the table on which it had lain, and took several general views of the apartment. Then Miss Robinson was delegated to interview the servants, and in view of the eager expectancy on the faces of Colonel Kingston Bruce and Mrs. Betts, Tommy felt called upon to say a few authoritative words. The position amounts to this, he said. Either the pearl is still in the house, or it is not still in the house. Quite so, said the Colonel with more respect than was, perhaps, quite justified by the nature of the remark. If it is not in the house, it may be anywhere, but if it is in the house, it must necessarily be concealed somewhere. And a search must be made, broke in Colonel Kingston Bruce. Quite so. I give you carte blanche, Mr. Blunt. Search the house from attic to cellar. Oh, Charles, murmured Mrs. Kingston Bruce tearfully. Do you think that is wise? The servants won't like it. I'm sure they'll leave. We will search their quarters last, said Tommy soothingly. The thief is sure to have hidden the gem in the most unlikely place. I seem to have read something of the kind, agreed the Colonel. Quite so, said Tommy. You probably remember the case of Rex, Ver Bailey, which created a precedent. "Oh, yes," said the Colonel, looking puzzled. "Now, the most unlikely place is in the apartments of Mrs. Betts," continued Tommy. "My, wouldn't that be too cute?" said Mrs. Betts admiringly. Without more ado, she took him up to her room, where Tommy once more made use of the special photographic apparatus. Presently, Tuppence joined him there. "You have no objection, I hope, Mrs. Betts, to my assistance looking through your wardrobe?" "Why, not at all. Do you need me here any longer?" Tommy assured her that there was no need to detain her, and Mrs. Betts departed. "We might as well go on bluffing it out," said Tommy, "but personally I don't believe we've a dog's chance of finding the thing. Curse you and your 24-hour stunt, Tuppence." "Listen," said Tuppence. "The servants are all right, I'm sure, but I managed to get something out of the French maid. It seems that when Lady Laura was staying here a year ago, she went out to tea with some friends of the Kingston Bruces, and when she got home, a teaspoon fell out of her muff. Everyone thought it must have fallen in by accident. But, talking about similar robberies, I got hold of a lot more. Lady Laura is always staying about with people. She hasn't got a bean, I gather, and she's out for comfortable quarters with people to whom a title still means something. It may be a coincidence, or it may be something more, but 5 distinct thefts have taken place whilst she has been staying in various houses, sometimes trivial things, sometimes valuable jewels." "Whew," said Tommy, and gave vent to a prolonged whistle. "Where's the old bird's room, do you know?" "Just across the passage. Then I rather think, that we'll just slip across and investigate." The room opposite stood with its door ajar. It was a spacious apartment with white enamelled fitments and rose-pink curtains. An inner door led to a bathroom. At the door of this appeared a slim, dark girl, very neatly dressed. Tuppence checked the exclamation of astonishment on the girl's lips. "This is Elise, Mr. Blunt," she said primly. "Lady Laura's maid." Tommy stepped across the threshold of the bathroom and approved inwardly its sumptuous and up-to-date fittings. He set to work to dispel the wide stare of suspicion on the French girl's face. "You are busy with your duties, eh, Mademoiselle Elise?" "Yes, monsieur. I clean milady's bath." "Well, perhaps you'll help me with some photography instead. I have a special kind of camera here, and I am photographing the interiors of all the rooms in this house." He was interrupted by the communicating door to the bedroom banging suddenly behind him. Elise jumped at the sound. "What did that?" "It must have been the wind," said Tuppence. "We will come into the other room," said Tommy. Elise went to open the door for them, but the doorknob rattled aimlessly. "What's the matter?" said Tommy sharply. "Ah, monsieur, but somebody must have locked it on the other side." She caught up a towel and tried again, but this time the door handle turned easily enough, and the door swung open. "Voilà ce qui est curieux. It must have stuck," said Elise. There was no one in the bedroom. Tommy fetched his apparatus. Tuppence and Elise worked under his orders, but again and again his glance went back to the communicating door. "I wonder," he said between his teeth. "I wonder why that door stuck." He examined it minutely, shutting and opening it. It fitted perfectly. "One picture more," he said with a sigh. "Will you loop back that rose curtain, Mademoiselle Elise? Thank you. Just hold it so." The familiar click occurred. He handed a glass slide to Elise to hold, relinquished the tripod to Tuppence, and carefully readjusted and closed the camera. He made some easy excuse to get rid of Elise, and as soon as she was out of the room, he caught hold of Tuppence and spoke rapidly. "Look here, I've got an idea. Can you hang on here? Search all the rooms that will take some time. Try and get an interview with the old bird lady Laura, but don't alarm her. Tell her you suspect the parlour-maid. But whatever you do, don't let her leave the house. I'm going off in the car. I'll be back as soon as I can." "All right," said Tuppence. "But don't be too cocksure. You've forgotten one thing." "What's that?" "The girl. There's something funny about that girl. Listen, I've found out the time she started from the house this morning. It took her 2 hours to get to our office. That's nonsense. Where did she go before she came to us?" "There's something in that," admitted her husband. "Well, follow up any old clue you like, but don't let Lady Laura leave the house." "What's that?" His quick ear had caught a faint rustle outside on the landing. He strode across to the door, but there was no one to be seen. "Well, so long," he said. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Tuppence watched him drive off in the car with a faint misgiving. Tommy was very sure. She herself was not so sure. There were one or two things she did not quite understand. She was still standing by the window, watching the road, when she saw a man leave the shelter of a gateway opposite, cross the road and ring the bell. In a flash, Tuppence was out of the room and down the stairs. Gladys Hill, the parlour-maid, was emerging from the back part of the house, but Tuppence motioned her back authoritatively. Then she went to the front door and opened it. A lanky young man with ill-fitting clothes and eager dark eyes was standing on the step. He hesitated a moment, and then said, "Is Miss Kingston Bruce in?" "Will you come inside?" said Tuppence. She stood aside to let him enter, closing the door. "Mr. Rennie, I think," she said sweetly. He shot a quick glance at her. Yes. Will you come in here, please?" She opened the study door. The room was empty, and Tuppence entered it after him, closing the door behind her. He turned on her with a frown. "I want to see Miss Kingston Bruce." "I am not quite sure that you can," said Tuppence composedly. "Look here, who the devil are you?" said Mr. Rennie rudely. "International Detective Agency," said Tuppence succinctly, and noticed Mr. Rennie's uncontrollable start. "Please sit down, Mr. Rennie," she went on. "To begin with, we know all about Miss Kingston Bruce's visit to you this morning." It was a bold guess, but it succeeded. Perceiving his consternation, Tuppence went on quickly. "The recovery of the pearl is the great thing, Mr. Rennie. No one in this house is anxious for publicity. Can't we come to some arrangement?" The young man looked at her keenly. "I wonder how much you know," he said thoughtfully. "Let me think for a moment." He buried his head in his hands, then asked a most unexpected question. "I say, is it really true that young St. Vincent is engaged to be married?" "Quite true," said Tuppence. "I know the girl." Mr. Rennie suddenly became confidential. "It's been hell," he confided. "They've been asking him here morning, noon and night, chucking Beatrice at his head. All because he'll come into a title some day. If I had my way—" "Don't let's talk politics," said Tuppence hastily. "Do you mind telling me, Mr. Rennie, why you think Miss Kingston Bruce took the pearl?" I don't." "You do," said Tuppence calmly. "You wait to see the detective, as you think, drive off and the coast clear, and then you come and ask for her. It's obvious. If you'd taken the pearl yourself, you wouldn't be half so upset." "Her manner was so odd," said the young man. "She came this morning and told me about the robbery, explaining that she was on her way to a firm of private detectives. She seemed anxious to say something, and yet not able to get it out." "Well," said Tuppence, "all I want is the pearl. You'd better go and talk to her." But at that moment, Colonel Kingston Bruce opened the door. "Lunch is ready, Miss Robinson. You will lunch with us, I hope. Then he stopped and glared at the guest. "Clearly," said Mr. Rennie, "you don't want to ask me to lunch. All right, I'll go." "Come back later," whispered Tuppence as he passed her. Tuppence followed Colonel Kingston Bruce, still growling into his moustache about the pestilential impudence of some people, into a massive dining room, where the family was already assembled. Only one person present was unknown to Tuppence. "This, Lady Laura, is Miss Robinson, who is kindly assisting us." Lady Laura bent her head, and then proceeded to stare at Tuppence through her pince-nez. She was a tall, thin woman, with a sad smile, a gentle voice, and very hard, shrewd eyes. Tuppence returned her stare, and Lady Laura's eyes dropped. After lunch, Lady Laura entered into conversation with an air of gentle curiosity. How was the inquiry proceeding? Tuppence laid suitable stress on the suspicion attaching to the parlour-maid, but her mind was not really on Lady Laura. Lady Laura might conceal teaspoons and other articles in her clothing, but Tuppence felt fairly sure that she had not taken the pink pearl. Presently Tuppence proceeded with her search of the house. Time was going on. There was no sign of Tommy and, what mattered far more to Tuppence, there was no sign of Mr. Rennie. Suddenly Tuppence came out of a bedroom and collided with Beatrice Kingston Bruce, who was going downstairs. She was fully dressed for the street. "I'm afraid," said Tuppence, "that you mustn't go out just now." The other girl looked at her haughtily. "Whether I go out or not is no business of yours," she said coldly. "It is my business whether I communicate with the police or not, though," said Tuppence. In a minute the girl had turned ashy pale. "You mustn't, you mustn't. I won't go out, but don't do that." She clung to Tuppence beseechingly. "My dear Miss Kingston Bruce," said Tuppence, smiling, "the case has been perfectly clear to me from the start. But she was interrupted. In the stress of her encounter with the girl, Tuppence had not heard the front door-bell. Now, to her astonishment, Tommy came bounding up the stairs, and in the hall below she caught sight of a big burly man in the act of removing a bowler hat. "Detective Inspector Marriott of Scotland Yard," he said with a grin. With a cry, Beatrice Kingston Bruce tore herself from Tuppence's grasp and dashed down the stairs, just as the front door was opened once more to admit Mr. Rennie. "Now you have torn it," said Tuppence bitterly. "Eh?" said Tommy, hurrying into Lady Laura's room. He passed on into the bathroom and picked up a large cake of soap which he brought out in his hands. The inspector was just mounting the stairs. "She went quite quietly," he announced. "She's an old hand, and knows when the game is up. What about the pearl?" "I rather fancy," said Tommy, handing him the soap, "that you'll find it in here." The inspector's eyes lit up appreciatively. "An old trick, and a good one. Cut a cake of soap in half, scoop out a place for the jewel, clap it together again, and smooth the join-wed over with hot water. A very smart piece of work on your part, sir." Tommy accepted the compliment gracefully. He and Tuppence descended the stairs. Colonel Kingston Bruce rushed at him and shook him warmly by the hand. "My dear sir, I can't thank you enough. Lady Laura wants to thank you also." "I am glad we have given you satisfaction," said Tommy, "but I'm afraid I can't stop. I have a most urgent appointment. Member of the Cabinet." He hurried out to the car and jumped in. Tuppence jumped in beside him. "But, Tommy," she cried, "haven't they arrested Lady Laura after all?" "Oh," said Tommy, "didn't I tell you? They've not arrested Lady Laura. They've arrested Elise. You see," he went on, as Tuppence sat dumbfounded, "I've often tried to open a door with soap on my hands myself. It can't be done, your hands slip. So I wondered what Elise could have been doing with the soap to get her hands as soapy as all that. She caught up a towel, you remember, so there were no traces of soap on the handle afterwards. But it occurred to me that if you were a professional thief, it wouldn't be a bad plan to be made to a lady suspected of kleptomania, who stayed about a good deal in different houses. So I managed to get a photo of her as well as of the room, induced her to handle a glass slide, and toddled off to dear old Scotland Yard. Lightning development of negative, successful identification of fingerprints and photo. Elise was a long-lost friend. Useful place, Scotland Yard. "And to think," said Tuppence, finding her voice, "that those two young idiots were only suspecting each other in that weak way they do it in books. But why didn't you tell me what you were up to when you went off?" "In the first place, I suspected that Elise was listening on the landing, and in the second place—" "Yes?" "My learned friend forgets," said Tommy. "Thorndyke never tells until the last moment. Besides, Tuppence, you and your pal Janet Smith put one over on me last time. This makes us square."